Something happened in the last 3 years that the mainstream tech media, whose coverage of the operating system landscape has been dominated by the Microsoft narrative, whose marketing budget funds the coverage cycle has not been covering with the urgency that the magnitude of the shift, whose documentation this examination is providing, deserves as the story whose implications for every person sitting in front of a computer right now are the implications of the platform war whose outcome the data has already decided, even as the mainstream conversation continues performing the debate, whose conclusion the numbers settled quietly while nobody in the mainstream conversation was paying attention. The shift is real. The data is public. The conclusion is available to anyone whose willingness to examine the actual numbers, rather than the narrative that the mainstream coverage has been substituting for the numbers, produces the finding that this examination is making explicit, because the finding's explicitness is the contribution that the audience whose computing decisions the finding affects deserves, rather than the continued performance of the debate whose outcome the data resolved. Linux killed Windows. Not in the dramatic overnight collapse that the headline's phrasing implies as the sudden event whose occurrence the dramatic framing suggests, but in the slow, methodical, infrastructure-level displacement whose completeness the current state of global computing reveals when the examination moves past the desktop market share statistics whose Windows dominance the mainstream narrative uses as the evidence that the Windows platform's relevance continues unchallenged, and into the server infrastructure, the cloud computing architecture, the mobile computing foundation, the supercomputing environment, the embedded systems landscape, and the developer toolchain ecosystem whose Linux dominance the examination of each domain's current state confirms as the aggregate picture of a platform displacement whose scope the desktop market share statistics were never going to capture, because the desktop was never the battlefield where the war's outcome was going to be decided. Let's start with the number that should have ended the conversation years ago, but somehow never made it into the mainstream tech media's coverage of the operating system war with the prominence that its magnitude demands. 96.3%. That is the percentage of the world's top 1 million web servers that run Linux. Right now, today, as you watch this video on a device whose request to load this content was served by a Linux machine whose operation you never thought about, because the infrastructure, whose invisibility is the infrastructure's success, does not announce itself the way the Windows desktop announces itself with the logo and the startup sound, whose familiarity the Windows user recognizes as the platform's presence. The internet runs on Linux, not mostly, not predominantly, overwhelmingly, completely, at a percentage whose magnitude makes the remaining fraction's Windows presence the exception that the Linux dominance's rule defines, rather than the competition that the debate's framing implies when the mainstream conversation discusses operating system relevance, as though the server infrastructure whose Linux dominance the 96% establishes is not the relevance metric that determines which platform won. But the server infrastructure's Linux dominance is only the beginning of the killing's documentation. The cloud computing revolution, whose transformation of the computing landscape the last decade produced, was not the Windows cloud revolution. Amazon Web Services, whose infrastructure runs approximately 33% of the global internet's cloud workloads, runs Linux. Google Cloud Platform, whose infrastructure runs a significant portion of the remaining cloud workloads, runs Linux on infrastructure that Google built specifically on Linux, because the Linux platform's performance characteristics, its customizability, and its cost structure made it the only rational choice for the cloud infrastructure whose scale demands the efficiency that the Linux platform's architecture provides, and the Windows platform's licensing model makes economically impossible at the scale that the cloud infrastructure's operation requires. Microsoft Azure, whose irony is the irony of the Windows company's cloud platform running a significant portion of its workloads on Linux, confirmed in 2019 that more than half of its virtual machine instances run Linux. The Windows company's own cloud platform runs more Linux than Windows. If that single fact does not communicate the magnitude of the shift, whose documentation this examination is providing, then the examination needs to continue until the accumulation of the evidence, whose individual piece the single fact represents, produces the complete picture whose assembly from the individual facts makes the killing's reality impossible to dismiss. The supercomputing environment story is the story that the Linux killing's documentation requires telling, because the supercomputing environment's demands are the demands of the most performance-sensitive, reliability-critical, resource-intensive computing workloads, whose platform choice reveals which operating system the people, whose understanding of computing performance is the deepest understanding available, chose when the choice was made without the marketing budget's influence and with the performance requirements' clarity. The top 500 list, which ranks the world's 500 fastest supercomputers, has been 100% Linux since November 2017. 100%. Every single one of the 500 most powerful computers on the planet runs Linux. The weather forecasting systems whose predictions inform the emergency management decisions that save lives run Linux. The nuclear research facilities whose simulations inform the physics understanding that advances human knowledge run Linux. The pharmaceutical research infrastructure whose molecular simulations accelerate the drug discovery process that produces the treatments whose development serves human health runs Linux. The financial modeling infrastructure whose risk calculations inform the economic decisions that move markets runs Linux. The people who need computing to work perfectly, who cannot afford the performance degradation or the reliability failure that the wrong platform choice produces, chose Linux unanimously and have maintained that choice with the consistency whose duration confirms it as the considered assessment rather than the temporary preference. Now here's where the killing's most consequential dimension requires the examination's attention, because the most consequential dimension is not the server infrastructure's Linux dominance or the supercomputing environment's Linux unanimity. The most consequential dimension is the dimension that the mainstream conversation consistently misses, because the mainstream conversation's operating system discussion is the desktop operating system discussion, whose Windows dominance the market share statistics confirm, and whose confirmations the mainstream conversation treats as the evidence that Windows won the operating system war, when the desktop operating system discussion was never the war's decisive theater. The most consequential dimension is the mobile computing dimension, whose examination reveals that the device in your pocket, which is the computer that you interact with more hours per day than the computer on your desk, runs Linux. Android is Linux, not Linux-inspired, not Linux-adjacent. Linux. The Android kernel is the Linux kernel. The operating system that runs on approximately 72% of the world's smartphones is a Linux distribution whose mobile optimization the Google engineers who built Android on the Linux Foundation produced by taking the Linux kernel, whose stability, security architecture, and performance characteristics made it the foundation whose selection for the world's most widely used computing platform. The selection's outcome validates as the correct foundation choice. When you count the devices running Linux across the server infrastructure, the cloud computing platforms, the supercomputing environment, the smartphone ecosystem, the embedded systems whose Linux presence includes the smart TVs, the routers, the automotive infotainment systems, the industrial control systems, and the Internet of Things devices, whose aggregate count exceeds the billions. The Linux device count dwarfs the Windows device count by the margin, whose magnitude makes the Windows desktop dominance's continuation the niche story rather than the platform war's defining statistic. Windows runs on desktops. Linux runs on everything else, including a growing number of desktops whose growth, the Steam Deck's success, the developer workstation, migration's acceleration, and the corporate desktop deployment's gradual Linux adoption is producing as the desktop market share shift, whose pace the mainstream conversation consistently underestimates, because the desktop market share statistics' annual change is the incremental change, whose accumulation over the measurement period, the annual snapshot, misses as the trend that the longer view reveals. The developer ecosystem's migration is the killing's dimension that matters most for understanding where the operating system war's next phase is heading, because the developers are the people who build the software whose availability determines the platform's value for the users, whose platform choice the software availability influences. The developers left Windows. Not all of them, and not suddenly, but the Stack Overflow Developer Survey, whose annual methodology captures the developer community's platform. Preference with the sample size, whose representativeness the survey's 20-year history establishes, as the reliable measurement has been documenting the Linux and macOS desktop usage's growth among professional developers, as the trend whose direction the Windows desktop usage's corresponding decline confirms as the developer community's genuine preference shift, rather than the survey artifact. In 2024, more professional developers use Linux or macOS as their primary development environment than use Windows. The people who build the software chose Linux, when the people who build the thing chose a different thing for themselves. The thing they chose is the thing whose future the builder's confidence in it expresses as the preference whose significance the builder's expertise makes the informed signal rather than the casual choice. The Windows subsystem for Linux is the admission that the mainstream conversation has not been reading as the admission it is. Microsoft, the company whose Windows platform's developer relevance, the developer community's migration, was threatening with the replacement of the Windows development environment with the Linux development environment, whose superiority the migrating developer's choice expressed, responded to the migration not by improving the Windows development environment to the level whose competition with the Linux development environment would reverse the migration. but by embedding Linux inside Windows so that the developers whose Linux preference was driving the migration could run Linux inside Windows and stay on the Windows platform whose departure their Linux preference was producing. The Windows subsystem for Linux is Microsoft saying, in the technical terms, whose implication the mainstream conversation has been declining to draw, that the Linux development environment is better than the Windows development environment, and that the best response to the developers leaving Windows for Linux is to bring Linux to Windows rather than to bring Windows to the level whose achievement would make Linux's presence inside Windows unnecessary. Microsoft shipped Linux inside Windows. The company whose identity is the Windows platform shipped Linux inside Windows because the Linux environment's superiority over the Windows environment for the developers whose retention the Windows platform's continued relevance requires was the reality whose accommodation the WSL represented as the strategic response to the migration that the Windows environment's improvement was not going to reverse. The security architecture's comparison is the killing's dimension that the enterprise computing environment's Linux adoption acceleration is being driven by, as the technical justification whose documentation, the security teams whose recommendation drives the enterprise platform decision are presenting to the executive decision makers whose approval the enterprise Linux deployment requires. The Windows security model's architecture is the architecture of the system designed for the consumer computing environment of the 1990s, whose security requirements were not the security requirements of the connected computing environment whose emergence the Internet's growth produced as the threat landscape that the consumer computing architecture was not designed to address. The Linux security model's architecture is the architecture of the system designed from the foundation for the multi-user, networked computing environment whose security requirements include the privilege separation, the access control, and the audit capability whose implementation the Linux architecture provides as the foundational design rather than the retrofitted addition whose integration into the existing architecture. The Windows security improvement represents as the approach whose limitation the Windows security architecture's persistent vulnerability to the malware ecosystem, whose Windows specialization the platform's consumer market dominance produced. The ransomware epidemic whose devastation of enterprise computing environments the last 5 years documented is the Windows ransomware epidemic. The malware ecosystem, whose Windows specialization the platform's dominance explains, is the ecosystem whose products are designed specifically for the Windows architecture's exploitation, whose delivery relies on the Windows execution environment, and whose impact is limited by the Linux architecture's structural resistance to the privilege escalation whose Windows implementation the ransomware's deployment requires. The enterprise computing environment whose Linux adoption the security requirement is accelerating is the environment whose IT security team's ransomware experience produced the platform reconsideration, whose outcome the Linux deployment represents as the security architecture's practical validation, in the environment whose stakes are the stakes of the real operational consequence, rather than the theoretical security analysis. Here's what makes the killing's documentation complete, and what makes the mainstream conversation's continued performance of the operating system debate, whose outcome the data settled the conversation that this examination is correcting. The killing happened at every level of the computing stack simultaneously. At the infrastructure level, where the servers that run the internet chose Linux unanimously. At the performance level, where the supercomputers that represent humanity's most demanding computing requirements chose Linux unanimously. At the scale level, where the cloud platforms that represent the computing future chose Linux as the foundation whose economics and performance characteristics made it the only rational choice. At the mobile level, where the smartphones that represent the computing present for most of the world's population run Linux as the foundation whose stability the platform's reliability requires. At the developer level, where the people who build the software chose Linux as the environment whose tools and architecture match the work's requirements better than the alternatives. And at the security level, where the enterprises whose operational continuity the platform's security architecture protects are choosing Linux as the security model whose structural advantages, the threat landscape's evolution, made the operationally necessary choice. Windows is not dead. The desktop market share statistics, whose Windows dominance the mainstream conversation cites as the evidence of Windows' continued relevance, are accurate. Windows runs on the majority of the world's desktop computers. The enterprise desktop's Windows deployment continues as the institutional inertia, whose reversal, the Linux desktop's improvement, is gradually producing but has not yet completed. The gaming ecosystem, whose Windows dominance, the DirectX investment, and the game developer relationships that Microsoft built over the decades of the Windows gaming platform's cultivation, maintains as the specific Windows advantage, whose erosion, the steam on Linux's progress, And the Steam Deck's success is producing, but has not yet completed, to the degree that the gaming use case's Windows requirement has been fully eliminated. But the desktop is not where the computing future lives. The desktop is where the computing past lives as the form factor, whose relevance the mobile computing revolution, whose Linux foundation runs, already transformed from the primary computing environment to the specialized computing environment for the specific tasks, whose desktop form factor the tasks requirements prefer. The computing future lives in the cloud infrastructure, whose Linux foundation runs. The computing future lives in the AI training infrastructure, whose Linux environment, the machine learning frameworks, whose GPU computation requirements, the Linux driver ecosystem serves better than the Windows driver ecosystem provides as the AI development environment. The computing future lives in the edge computing environment, whose Linux deployment, the embedded systems landscape's Linux dominance, has already established as the architecture whose extension the edge computing's requirements represent, rather than the new territory whose platform choice remains undecided. Linux killed Windows in the places where killing matters: in the infrastructure, in the performance environment, in the scale economy, in the developer community, in the security architecture, in the mobile foundation, in the AI training environment. In the future's computing architecture, whose Linux foundation, the present's computing infrastructure's Linux dominance, establishes as the continuation of the trajectory whose direction the data has been documenting. Across the decade of the shift, whose completeness this examination is making explicit, because the explicitness is the contribution that the audience whose computing understanding this channel exists to serve deserves. The killing is complete. The mainstream conversation's performance of the debate, whose outcome the data settled, is the conversation about the past, whose continuation the present's data does not support. Linux killed Windows. The data said so. The infrastructure confirmed it. The developers validated it. The security teams documented it. The supercomputers demonstrated it. The smartphones proved it. And now you know it, because the killing that nobody was talking about is the killing that this examination just talked about. And the talking about it is the beginning of the understanding whose completion. The complete picture whose assembly this examination provided makes available to the audience whose platform. Understanding the complete picture improves over the incomplete picture whose correction this examination delivered. The war is over. Linux won. The only question remaining is how long the mainstream conversation continues pretending otherwise.